Croeso, welcome. This is Benjamin, and today I've got a fable in a way for you of two parts, of two teams, about chariot teams in the Roman Republic which traveled through time all the way through to the later stages of the Byzantine Empire in a way. Secondly, how that reflects upon us today in the West, especially Wales, which I focus a lot on, but broadly, how we in the West risk making the same mistakes that people made back then with cults and factions pit against each other against reason, and what it can do to a society if it gets out of hand. The poet Genevo in the early 2nd century wrote that the common people, rather than caring about their freedom, only care for bread and circuses. Or to put it another way, the commoners only cared about food, and then after that, bloodshed and entertainment. Because the most popular entertainments offered by the circuses of Rome were the gladiators and chariot racing, and you might not have thought it, but chariot racing was as bloody and deadly as gladiators. As many as 12 four-horse teams raced one another 7 times. Around the greatest arenas, the Circus Maximus in Rome was 2,000 feet long, but its track was not more than 150 feet wide. The rules were few, collisions all but inevitable, and hideous injuries befell the charioters. They were extremely commonplace. We often hear in inscriptions about charioteers dying in their early 20s, crushed against the spina that ran down the center of the racetrack, or dragged behind their horses and trampled. Charioteers generally started out as slaves who took these risks because there were fortunes to be won, not just their freedom. Successful racers who survived, at least, could grow enormously wealthy. The poet Martial grumbled in the 1st century that it was possible to earn as many as 15 bags of gold for winning a single race. Diocles, the most successful charioteer perhaps in history, earned an estimated 36 million sesterces, or Roman money, in the course of his glittering career. To put it into context, that sum was enough to feed the city of Rome for an entire year. Not to be laughed at, not bad for one race. During the Roman Republic, the races featured 4 color-themed teams: the reds, the whites, the greens, and the blues, each which attracted fanatical and hooligan-like support. And these evolved over the centuries, cults of their own, mad followers who would get in fights with each other over these competitions. By the time the Western Empire fell, and going towards the 6th century of the Common Era, only 2 of these teams survived. The greens had absorbed the reds, and the whites had been absorbed into the blues. But the 2 surviving teams were very popular in the Eastern Empire, which became known as the Byzantine Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, and their supporters were passionate, so much so they frequently entered into bloody riots and street battles with one another. Exactly what these colors stood for remains a mystery for historians. For a long time, we thought that the 2 groups gradually evolved into what were essentially early political parties. The blues, for the ruling classes. Blue, traditionally, is connected in Europe to the aristocracy and ruling class, and that stems in a way from Roman imperial purple. Similar ingredients in many cases were used to produce these colors. Green, on the other hand, was a bit easier to make, at least the kind of green they had, and green became the team of a working class in a way. But also the state church was connected to the elite, the Orthodox, and so that became embedded with interest in the blue team of charioters. But when heresies arose in the church, rebellions of its teachings, wanting to instigate a new ecclesiastical tradition, those would connect to the green team and use them to rebel against the blues. And this happened standing for religious orthodoxy. And the Greens being the party of the people. The Greens were also depicted as proponents of the highly divisive theology of monophysitism, a heresy with large influence, which held that Christ was not at one time both divine and human, but only of a single nature. This was sacrilegious to mainstream Christianity. In the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era, it even threatened to tear the Byzantine Empire apart. These views have been challenged. The games were more important than politics in this period, but people wishing to gain influence would jump back and forth between these teams, which would affect politics, and were capable, certainly, of arousing passions. In 501, Greens ambushed the blues in Constantinople's amphitheatre and killed 3,000 of them. This was no light-hearted match of our team will play yours. No, this was full-on bloodshed of competition. 4 years later in Antioch there were riots when a charioteer Porphyrius won. He was triumphant, and the anger was because he had defected from one team to the other, and this was not taken well. Around the year 500, this rivalry between the Greens and the Blues escalated and spread far beyond Constantinople's Chariot Racing track. The Hippodrome was a slightly smaller version in Constantinople of the Circus Maximus in Rome. And it was positioned in such a way that it suggests they wanted to avoid certain uncomfortable events which had happened by that point in history with racing teams. They had learned. So the Imperial Palace was positioned above it. And another hill this way had garrisons, and another hill around it, scooping around, had another military garrison and towers. So it was positioned to where any revolt would be easily controlled. They had learned not to let the Greens get out of hand. It was good giving the working class a voice to express itself, so long as it could be put in check swiftly. It was able to provide a sense of theatre to the common people. This friction between these two camps, Greens and Blues, came to a climax during the reign of Justinian, often called Justinian the Great. One of, if not Byzantium's greatest, but most controversial emperors. During Justinian's reign, the empire recovered much of its lost territory, including most of North Africa and the whole of Italy, but it did so at great cost, and only as the emperor was served by some of the most talented Byzantine heroes. The great general Belisarius, who some consider to be the last great Roman general, an aged but vastly competent eunuch named Narcissus, and an astute great tax administrator, John of Cappadocia. John's chief duty was to raise money needed to fund Justinian's wars, and his ability to acquire finance made him as well the most hated man in the empire, not least among the common people, amongst the Blues and Greens, who didn't like these experts telling them what to do. Justinian had a fourth advisor, one whose influence over him was even more scandalous than John of Cappadocian's. This was his wife, Theodora, who stands out as a great figure in Byzantine history, and this does relate to the charioting teams. She refused to play the subordinate role normally expected of a woman. Theodora, who was, according to legend, astoundingly beautiful and unusually witty and intelligent, took an active role in ruling the empire alongside Justinian, not underneath him. This was controversial enough in itself, but it was rendered vastly more so by the empress's lowly origins. The Greens felt slighted, and perhaps rightly so, but if you had any sense and wanted to get ahead in the world, you would support the Blues because that was the party of the establishment, so it would be a bit silly to support the Greens. By 532, John of Cappadocia had raised 26 new taxes upon some of the wealthiest citizens, merchants and a lot of expertise-related people across the empire. And this, combined with these factional tensions, raised a lot of contention in these races, and they began to express a political sentiment that really wasn't there before and certainly began to gather pace. Shockwaves of these taxes were felt across the imperial capital in the agitation of the arena. These already existing contentions, like kindling of an underforest before a fire, were only built up higher when fighting broke out between the Greens and the Blues on the 10th of January, and Justinian reacted quite harshly, wanting to immediately push out any suggestion of rebellion. But I could explain why he came down harshly, considering that they were a threat to him at this point, as it was about to be proven quite drastically so. Thanks to Procopius, a writer of the time who wrote Secret History, we have a good idea of how Theodora met Justinian in about the year 520, since Procopius utterly despised her. We also have what is likely the most uncompromisingly direct personal attack mounted on any emperor or empress. He portrayed Theodora as a wanton harlot, almost, of the most promiscuous sort. From our view, Theodora's morals are less important than her affiliations. Her mother was likely an acrobat and entertainer. She was certainly married to the man who held the position of bearkeeper to the Greens. And so Theodora was born into a camp supporting the Greens. But when this father died unexpectedly, leaving her with 3 younger daughters, the mother was left extremely poor. Desperate, she hastily remarried and went with her infant children to the arena, where she begged the Greens to find a job for her new husband. They ignored her, but the Blues, sensing an opportunity to paint themselves as more generous and great, found work for him. Thereafter, Theodora grew up to be a violent partisan of the Blues, and her fervent, fanatical support for the faction became a factor in the Byzantine Empire's life after 527, when she was crowned as empress. Not least because the Emperor Justinian prior had given 30 years of loud support for the same team, and so the Greens felt a bit slighted, sensing the disorder had the potential to spread, and avoiding his allegiance to the Blues, the Emperor sent in his troops. 7 of the ringleaders in the rioting were condemned to death. The 7 men were taken out of the city a few days later to be hanged at Sykai, across the water on the east side of the Bosphorus. But the executions were messed up. 2 of the 7 survived when the scaffold broke. The mob that had gathered to watch the hangings cut them down and hurried them off to the safety of a nearby temple. The 2 men were, as it happened, one a blue and one a green. The next time the chariots raced, the Blues and the Greens united against Justinian up in the Emperor's box. That would have been quite uncomfortable, seeing this division that you had been able to use to control and facilitate extension of your power come together against you. That would be terrifying. The Greens vented their resentment at the imperial couple's support for their rivals, and the Blues their anger at Justinian's sudden withdrawal of favor. Together the two factions shouted the words of encouragement they usually reserved for the charioters: Nika, Nika. Win, win, and it became clear that the victory they hoped for was of the factions over the emperor himself. With the races hastily forgotten, the mob poured out into the city and began to burn Constantinople down. For 5 days the rioting continued. The Nico riots were the biggest social upheaval in the Byzantine Empire's history. It nearly brought down its greatest emperor. Half the city was destroyed. Buildings which were from classical antiquity gone. Completely erased much of the city. It was horrific in terms of death toll. Tens of thousands of people died. On the 4th day of the riot, the rioters selected a nephew of a former ruler, Hypatius, and put him on the throne in the arena of the Hippodrome. And perhaps this was a bit too far, for that is the place where most of them died. His empress wife refused to consider any cowardice on the part of the emperor, and she said, "If you, my lord, wish to save your skin, you will have no hardship in doing so. We are rich, there is the sea, there too are our ships. But consider first whether, when you reach safety, you will regret that you did not choose death in preference. As for me, I stand by the ancient saying, the purple is the noblest winding sheet." Justinian was shamed, and now determined to stay and fight. What's most striking about Justinian the Great's reign and this moment in which the power of the charioteer teams was broken is that it was a woman who stood up and said, "No, behave like a man, have heroic ideals, be proud of your masculinity, die with dignity and honor with a sword in your hand. If you're going to go out, be a king, have that royal cloth around you." And this must have been a great woman. She was able to convey the ideals of masculinity and manhood and reinforce them as a desire within her man. Your job is to rule and be a noble, great man, and I'm going to push you to remember what you are supposed to do, your duty as a man. He had his team with him. Both Belisarius and Narcissus were with him in the palace, and the two generals planned a counter-strike. The Blues and the Greens, still assembled in the Hippodrome, were to be locked in the arena. After that, loyal troops, most of them Thracians and Goths, peoples of the north with no allegiance to either of the circus factions, would be sent in to cut the people down. Imagine a sporting arena today. Millennium Stadium in Cardiff, in Cardiff. A baseball game at Wigley Field. Tens of thousands of people. Imagine watching a sporting event and suddenly the exits are blocked off. Soldiers have arrived and all around you people begin dying and the ground is just soaked in blood and crying and all those people gone. And the loss it would have been to the empire, the merchants, the artisans that would have been killed, the economic output lost in those citizens. These would not have been the lowest of the poor. These would have been what little middle class you had in those days. And those people were important to an empire being prosperous. It would have been a deep loss, horrific. And yet, Justinian reigned for 30 years after trade-offs, I guess. With the massacre complete, Justinian and Theodora had little trouble re-establishing control over their smoldering capital. The rebels' property was confiscated, and John of Cappadocia was swiftly reinstalled to levy yet more heavy taxes on the depopulated city. So, how does this relate to Wales and the West in that wider sense? These two factions, yes, it was pleasure and enjoyment to begin, but it grew into cults of identity that you couldn't transgress. It was an illiberalism. It was a prison of social confines, ideological. It arose into the religious and iconoclastic sphere. And what we see in the West today, we see base, woke, progressive, regressive, different groups. In Wales, there's this horrific divide between unionists and nationalists. You know, if you say you're right-wing, people throw words at you like fascist. Like, wait, what? What's that got to do with merely having right-wing views? Or if you're left-wing, people throw words at you like Marxist. Like, what's Marxist have to do with merely having left-wing views? And so we're seeing here, in our time in our country, a division that is similar in a way. Now, it's not attached to the passions of watching animals rush down the track as people throw whips and spears at each other, thankfully. But if we don't rein it in, social media and the way we communicate with each other now is exacerbating this and doing a lot to our country, Wales, that we saw in that hippodrome. If we as a country are torn between blue and red, socialist and conservative, to the fact that we can't form a bridge between us or see that both sides have ideas and values that are wholly correct and right at times for when the country needs it at times. Our beliefs cease becoming what we believe to be true with careful consideration and thought. They turn into a cult of identity where we attach labels to what we see as pure and good or evil and sin. And then we don't see them, gradually we don't see them as human beings. We see them as the other we must fight so that it does not pervade and poison our identity cult. And I worry we go down that path in the West and in Wales because we are part of this world. If you have made it to the end and watched this, merci beaucoup, diolch yn fawr iawn. Please join me on Patreon. And I would like to thank my Patreons for their support. See them on the screen now. And to each and every one of you who have watched, thank you so much. Diolch yn fawr iawn. We'll see you in the next.